like this is 2 times length and then
Well, it's a very good.
now that we've been in the class for a little while, I want to remind us of the course goals. So we want you to be able to recognize and use appropriate scientific terminology, understand major evolutionary and ecological principles, design, plan, and carry out an experiment, write a lab report with appropriate format using statistics, interpret graphs and figures, locate primary and secondary literature, read, summarize, and interpret the primary literature, and then ask and answer questions with proximate and ultimate answers. Which of these would you say we've likely already focused on? What have we started to approach out of these course goals? What have we kind of looked at, begun on? Pardon? Interpreting graphs and figures. Yeah, you guys have definitely had to do that. You even had to sort of fill in some of your own, right? Cool. All right. So we've interpreted graphs and figures. I'm going to mark that. We've been working on that. What else have we been working on? Design. Absolutely. We haven't quite carried out an experiment yet, but you've already designed and planned out, and soon you will carry out an experiment. What else have you all worked on?
Answering questions approximately and ultimately. Okay,
and then what is? Do you guys know what do we mean by proximate and ultimate questions or answers?
Probably new terminology.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I don't think I've focused on that until
Is it what we think the answer is?
What we think the answer is, and then what? What the answer actually is. No, it does have to do with, so are you saying proximate would be sort of our first pass at it, and ultimate would be sort of confirming? No, that's a good guess. Good guess. It's kind of along the lines of proximate being sort of more near and ultimate being sort of more far.
Proximate ones are like the basic answer, what directly applies to something, whereas the ultimate answers are more like the general background of everything, all the reasons.
Okay, so approximate answer is immediately, so if you asked why am I upright and not falling down on the ground? Well, the proximate answer would probably be, well, I'm wearing shoes that create enough friction that I'm not slipping and falling on the floor. The ultimate answer might be, friction allows all of us to move around on the planet without falling down most of the time. Does that kind of make sense? So the approximate answer is sort of a more basic answer, and then the ultimate answer is more having to do with sort of the structure of the universe. How
of course, evolutionary ecology and evolutionary biology would oftentimes find this functional answers.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, to take your example, why am I standing up? Well, I'm standing up because I have a pelvic girdle issue, or I have bone structure because this and that, I have muscles that are right this way.
Right.
The ultimate question then actually would be evolutionarily, why are those bone structures and muscle structures like that way in human beings? So she's describing it for you in a general scientific way. More specifically in this class, it's kind of functional questions and answers versus evolutionary questions and answers. And that's the tricky thing about why. Sometimes why you're some way, or why an organism is doing something a particular way, has both an approximate answer and an ultimate answer.
Most of the time it does. All right, so anything else that we've worked on thus far?
Those are the only three, really?
Awesome. Who said that? Awesome. For the win. For sure. I would say those are probably the major ones that y'all have worked on thus far. We are going to, and certainly I guess if you include statistics and experimental design in evolutionary and ecological principles, that would be sort of a very broad way to define them. You could sort of categorize them that way. I would not. Those would be general scientific principles. Obviously haven't written a lab report, haven't had to search for primary and secondary literature, or read or summarize and interpret primary literature yet. So those are things that we have yet to work on. All right, so learning goals thus far. So take 2 minutes and talk with your group about what do you think the main points have been so far in class? What do we want you to take home from the last, week and a half? We've had the statistics using the finches as an example, and we've done that coot activity. Right? Go ahead and brainstorm.
Not doing high school way of thinking, being more practical, in depth. Thinking more, not like on the surface, especially those observations I do, not doing like just like the surface observations, like actually really like analyze. Being super analytical. Statistics. Alright.
Right, as soon as you have a main point from class thus far, jump up there, write it down. The faster you do that, the less you have to think. Right?
I think it is. What? Like, I never really had searching for your points. I'm confused to understand my thoughts. So I've been like
Oh, awesome. I gave you that for now of the actual paper. Of that.
You can hang on to the markers for now.
No. Everyone gets one. Yeah. I got shit pilot. Shit.
That was how you said it.
Yeah,
I was like, you got that. What? Have you seen that?
I think so. Oh yeah.
Shipped to my bed.
Yeah, I've seen
yours.
Yeah, I see that.
All right. So Austin, you threw some stuff up here. Kevin, your table threw some stuff up here. Cody, was that you? Who up here? Cody wrote some stuff. Okay, just making sure everybody's getting a chance to put their data up there. Okay, so main points in class so far: scientific method and practical knowledge. Okay, so tell me more about what you mean by practical knowledge.
So pretty much what we meant in a short sentence.
Sure. I mean, you can't write a paragraph there.
Just being more analytical and not doing surface observations like we probably would have been. So just thinking deeper.
Cool. Yeah. Applying your logic and critical thinking to what you're looking at. Cool. Awesome. Okay. So being more observant. The basics of being a better scientist. Absolutely, yeah, for sure. How to behave as a real scientist would, working with data, asking better questions. I would agree with all of these. Skills and methods of a scientist, thinking more like a scientist, implementing a scientific method, compiling and organizing data, being more critical about questions. Absolutely. Okay, so I would agree that all of these are great main points from our class thus far. I want to remind you of some sort of a more structured bulleted version of this I've provided for you. They'll be in the slides that I'll upload right after class. So this looks way detailed, but it's really just a few bullets. Basically, scientific method, incorporating these things that you just mentioned. The other thing to take home from those class sessions is the ability to use the COOT example to illustrate these things. So be sure that along with being comfortable with the parts of the scientific method, that you're also comfortable with using the COOT example. I was going to say COOT, the COOT example to illustrate some steps of the scientific method.
The reason for this is that when we ask you questions on the test, we're not going to ask you general questions, we're going to ask you questions about the examples that we used in class to test your understanding of the principles that we're illustrating.
Right, so rather than just, memorizing these things, can you tell where they're applied and how they should be applied to real world examples? Right. Okay, statistics. Y'all talked a little bit about statistics. I point you back to this. Is basically just a copy of the course goals that Dr. Polinsky showed you last time. And I would also add just, again, be able to use the Finch beak example to illustrate these statistical concepts as well. Sound good? Awesome. Okay. And so this is part of the sort of this is part of the post-class session slides that I'll post on iTunes. All right. So, oops, there we go. I don't know why I have an extra slide in there. All right, so today, rather than what I might normally do, which is to start with, our learning goals for today are bleh. Today I'm not going to tell you exactly what they are at first, because we're going to construct them as we go through class, and I'll make sure that at the end we have an overview of those course goals so you know exactly what you should be taking away from the activities that we do today. Sound good? Awesome. Do y'all have questions before we get started? Okay. All right, so in your groups, pull out that word cloud and compare within your groups. And pull out the concept maps and explain to each other your reasons for indicating the relationships between the words that you use. Take about 5 minutes.
Predation was what I Natural was pretty big on
Yeah.
The other ones like were literally small.
tried to figure out what it was about through this and put it through this. So I put like a big thing is the natural selection of common lizards, and then I put they evolved to like adapt because they have forms. I saw like hard spores somewhere in here, so I put that too. And I put it's like harder to be impaled by predators.
For mine, I just did I branched it off from selection because it was so much else. And from selection, I did lizards, natural, and predation. And then I also did some because I was like, I don't know if that's selection. But for predation, I put prey, species, and that's supposed to say predators, but it says predation because I guess those all go into predation, which then go to selection. Then it's natural, which is bioconfunction, because like natural selection usually happens in the wild. Otherwise, it'd be like selection, you know what I mean? And then there's a function. I don't know.
Yeah, I know.
And then for lizards, I put the shrikes because the shrikes actually. Yeah, and so they're actually predators, which all thing goes back to selection. And then flat-tailed goes in the lizard's horn, goes in the lizard's parietal. I know that has to do with yeah. So like I put that with the horn, so I branch off from there, and then direct selection. I do that. But once again, I just branched it off. I was like, I don't really know why that's there.
But now your friends can help you with things that you didn't get because you didn't have that word.
There we go.
All right. Once you've shared your reasoning behind how you constructed your concept map and why certain words point to other words, go ahead and work together as a group to create a group concept map. You can save that as like group concept map or concept map version 2 or whatever. But go ahead and make a new concept map that is the work of the group altogether.
And the goal of this is to make a concept map that reflects what you see.
Right. So we want to use these clues
To figure out what the paper is trying to communicate.
What am I game on
And now I know you're going to make a single group concept map, but you could easily sketch it out for each of you. You'll all want a copy of it in the end anyway.
Yeah, just remember to take a picture.
The group concept map will be for you to save to study by. Yeah. So I'll collect the individual ones, but you'll keep the group one.
So it's all of us.
Yeah, it's whatever you're
So I'm
comfortable with.
guessing with the main community Okay. What do we want branching out? Natural. Like, do you want it to be in the middle and things like that, or from the top?
up to you guys. Whatever works.
Yeah. You want to keep it at the top and branch it down?
I like that way.
Yeah.
It still make comments. But I mean, you want
Yeah, so you do that. So how many things do you have?
Yeah,
On my computer, it actually
I'll figure it out.
I don't know if you want shrikes.
They're birds.
Shrikes are birds.
Yeah.
So we could put shrikes, and then from that we could do predation. Yeah, I put as they're predators, and lizards are friends. So lizards are the prey shrikes.
You want me to put that off like this side right there?
We can do that.
Yeah.
Maybe like one about shrikes.
that.
Mhm.
Wow.
Also, was it to do with like the horns of all the
Yeah. Now shut up.
So if they're harder to do in scales by subtraction, would that be like over here?
Yes.
Yeah, what, I think what's so if that's just. Once again, you're not turning this in, we're just using this to help
Oh, this one goes.
All right, how we doing? Closer? 20 minutes. Five?
Yeah.
From that, so we have like, did you guys include varietal or anything?
Let's put varietals like in the same ranking because they're like
I put like this like I just have a question. Like does the length of the horns like have a factor?
show up anymore.
Yeah.
So one of the tricks about word cloud.
I didn't know if it meant length of lizard or length of horns, so I
Yeah, so there comes a point where the word circle gets so small that you can start ignoring them. And the trick is, well, what's the smallest word that I should pay attention to?
So we could do like,
I could even be branching off that one.
yeah.
Probably not, because they're going to pick them off and then use your own body weight to like. They're really strong. So to see how thick they're like, and then put together like. There are two like these guys are super vicious predators and yeah, I had no idea until I was so I did some high school at some state in the parking lot and I'll go over and there's a room under.
I didn't know what slot shows in there for. So I said, you want to do the high pitch
Yeah.
It's like branching up that way.
They have little like eagle like beaks. Like they have a hook on them. I'm like, oh,
This could be totally
No.
they're beaks. So that's why they. And then they really just strip the flesh off. Well, that's probably.
Okay, try to finish up in the next 2 minutes. Y'all need 2 minutes? Who needs 2 minutes? Couple of more minutes? Okay. All right, when you complete this, I'm not pressuring you to do it now, but take 2 minutes to finish up if you need to for your group concept map. Make sure that everyone can have a copy of that group concept map. I'll collect your individual ones today, but you'll want a copy of your group one that you decide on. You may end up correcting it before class is over, or not necessarily correcting, but maybe adding to it or changing it in some ways. So the one that you have right now is possibly not your final version, but you'll want it to help with studying for the class. Once you're finished with the group concept map, you can go to iTunes U to actually retrieve the actual article that was published in the journal Science. It's quite short, and I'd like you to actually just read it and examine the figures. At that time.
All right, so some of you, I didn't give the instructions clearly enough. I realized I didn't tell you that, yes, there's the text that you used for your word cloud, but there's actually the published version of the article with figures as well. So if you'll go to iTunes U and scroll to the bottom of the post for this week, it'll be there. If you don't see it, go ahead and sign out of iTunes U or close it all the way down and sign back in, and your iPad should update such that you can see the actual article. Yes, it should be one page and have a couple of pictures and some figures. It is pretty short.
I don't know, even know what's really. Javier, it was like kids. It was like kids. Stories.
All right, when you are finished reading the article, make sure to speak with your peers and your team and compare your understanding of the article, and go ahead and alter your concept map in any necessary way to reflect now what now you know what the article is about, right? So you can make additions, subtractions to your group concept map.
So, what if I added in a bunch of all like?
Yeah. And I also think that we could include a death it's their death rate is in relation to their length of possession. I don't know. I feel a lot like that. And then the flat hill, okay.
We can, yeah, we can change the length of one to a person provided.
It does. These things are creepy looking. But I never want to encounter one. Look, oh, look at this.
One way to make sure that you're on the same page is to have those already.
I actually think it generally we had a very good grasp on it. I just think we did not. We did not know about the. That'd be cool.
Like the average length of live forms whether it's longer.
Yeah. That's a bird.
So they grab him with that big beat, flies with ice and film. And then while he's struggling here, and it uses lots of speed.
If I were him, I'd have to just one of those.
Yeah.
What's an entire chance?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was always.
I would stay away from the
Yeah, I don't know if it's.
Horn frog.
Horn frog. I was just thinking like some of the models.
Minus a little TC.
They do look innocent.
Well, it's another one of those mascots, like a cardinal. It's not particularly fearsome. What are you gonna do? Sort of what out of that?
That actually, I think, would be much more than the cardinal being like, it's just close to my shrub.
It's kind of scary.
Why did you say it's one work is greater for longer? Does it mean the same thing? Or does it mean more?
It does in this case mean the same things. Yeah. So often scientists, sometimes they're just like too wordy, although but most of the time they're so they would say this particular trait is greater or less than, and in this case the trait is the length.
Yeah.
Right? So the trait, rather than just the horns being the trait, it's the length of the horn, so that's why they use it that way. All right, so take a minute or two to finish up that revised group concept map and make sure that everyone has copies of it. Woo! That's a field biology student. Yeah, you don't ever need to add one. If you don't come back, I'll search one.
Where's the field biologist?
Oh, there's a picture of a shrike in someone's hand, and the hand is like all kind of bloody and nicked up. Yeah, because it depends on how you catch them, certainly, but you're out in the field, there's
Probably and that's probably the bird attacking the hand.
so they have these sort of fine mesh nets that they can escape from once they find.
Yeah, really tangled up. And you have to untangle them while you're at sea. When they're attacking.
No, I'm sorry, no.
So everyone's okay with this?
Well, what they're working on is they would just like tear up the needles, like crack the needle. It's just when I saw them doing it, I'm like, don't do that.
Yeah, I was gonna print it out.
Yeah,
But I don't know when we need it by. Like, we need it. I was just planning on bringing it Wednesday. What else do we need to look for?
collection.
Because my like
And
email,
if they're gonna die anyway,
and because it's out of a different program, you can't like export it on like Hotmail. It has to be through the actual mail.
Yes. I'm ready. Oh my God. So cute.
Happy what's your Hector Suave? Okay, so if you are needing to finish the last little bit up on your concept map, that's okay. But I'd like to come back together as a class now to discuss what we've figured out about this article. So, what's going on in this article? What's it about? Shrikes and lizards. Okay. Which one made it fail? Okay, by the shrikes, right? Shrikes. Okay, so that's one thing we know. These kind of lizards. They may impale other lizards as well, I don't know.
They do. They can go and impale lizards, frogs, grasshoppers. Yeah, sure. If they're gonna eat it, that's how they're gonna eat it. They have, the reason they do this is birds have really weak feet. So normally if you were a hawk or an eagle, you would grab something with your gigantic talons and then rip its flesh from its body while you're holding onto it with your feet. But these are passerine birds, which are notoriously weak-footed birds because most of them aren't super predatory. And so they can't grab onto it while they're pulling on it. Not only that, with these large crabs, the feet are so small that your chances of losing that animal, losing your prey, are pretty likely because you just don't have a really strong grip. And so you grab it in your big, thick beak. You guys saw pictures of the shrikes. Haul it off somewhere and impale it. And then the plant, or the barbed wire, or whatever you impale it on, is doing the job that your feet would normally do, keeping that thing dead and stable. And then once it's impaled, then you can use your strong beak to strip all the flesh off.
The impalements provide a singularly well categorized, cataloged record of shrike kills, which allows the scientists, especially considering that the skulls remain intact on the impaling, so they can actually measure the lengths of the horns for the shrike kills. And no, this is a shrike kill because shrikes impale their victims like as if they're vampires.
The benefits of like the location of the horns and also like horns to protection against the shrikes.
Okay, so that was kind of their main question, right? So if we were to phrase that in sort of an evolutionary way, we would say something like, let me ask you, if you wanted to phrase it as far as what pressures the shrike might be putting on changes in the lizards, how would you state that hypothesis or question? Think about that for a second. What about table that? That's you guys, right? What do you think? How are you going to phrase that question as relating pressure that shrikes might put on lizards as far as change over time?
So lizards that have shorter horns are the ones that are being killed more often. So it puts an evolutionary pressure on the lizards to over time eventually grow longer horns. And it says like this difference in placement, like the squamosal horns grow faster than the parietal horns, so they would probably want to grow those horns first before.
Is that a good restatement of what you said? Okay. Does shrike predation select for longhorns? And by select, put pressure on the variation in that in the horn length in that community, such that over generations they'll develop longer horns in response to that shrike predation. Cool. So what did they find? What about for fast, for curious? What do you think? What would be the answer to their question?
Yes, it's going to kill more of that. Not sure.
Okay. So this is very, very useful because there's a distinction between the results of the article and the conclusion made from those results. So this would be a result. And you were wise to put it this way. So shrikes kill more lizards with short horns. Okay. And what did they conclude based on that answer? You guys. What did they conclude about this question? Because their question wasn't necessarily a proximal question like, do shrikes kill more lizards with short horns than lizards with long horns? That would be the proximal question. Their question is an ultimate question. Does shrike predation select for longhorn lizards? Right? So your conclusion is going to be how you relate back to this ultimate question, right? So what do they seem to think?
Okay, so they prefer the one.
The selection will prefer the longer horn lizards. Yeah. So do they think that selection is preferencing the longer horn lizards?
They concluded that shrike predation was one of the selective pressures for the longer horns. They suggested that it is possible that there are other selective pressures as well.
Okay. So that's also a predation. Shrike predation is a selective pressure impacting horn length. Okay. So did I teach you any of this information today? Did I tell you anything yet? A whole lot. What I did today was to set up a situation in which you could sort of more easily walk yourself through this kind of information. Do you feel like you learned about selective pressure and shrikes and lizards today? Cool. I want to point out that this is one of those types of things that you can do to help figure out the main points of an article, which things are really critically important and which things maybe aren't as important. Okay? So for example, I teach cell and molecular biology, and in that course, you will read articles about molecules in the cell, structures in the cell. There's a lot of details on a lot of new information. It's really hard to figure out what the main points are initially when you first start reading these articles. It's really hard to figure out what the main points are versus important supporting details, right? And activities like this can help you determine which things you should focus on to get the main points of the article and the main arguments of the authors. That makes sense? All right, so they said, and here's the, I have the pictures here. Right, so they show the expected survival of horned lizards with different horn lengths, okay? And they contrast where the shrike killed and the median shrike killed and live horn length is for these lizards. Why are they talking about survival? Why is survival important to their question? Because they're asking about natural selection. And we heard from Dr. Kowinski earlier that survival is a key determinant of your evolutionary fitness, right? Okay, if you can't survive and pass on offspring, your genes are gonna die, right? Your genes that give you especially great long lizard horns are not gonna be passed along in the population because you died, okay? If you're killed before you can reproduce, okay? Why did they look at different horns on the lizard's head?
Just like see which was more effective in their defense and evolutionary, how it would select which one grows faster.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can easily imagine a situation in which the placement of the horn can make a difference as far as protecting the lizard from being impaled, right? If the horn was on, you know, the back of their pelvic girdle, it might not help as much because that shrike is picking them up by their face and impaling them near their head, right?
Don't they actually have horns on the back of their pelvic girdle?
They do, but, pardon?
Tiny.
They're tiny in comparison, and because of the method of shrike killing, they didn't clean the nose.
Well, because by that point it's ripped off, so they can track it down.
That is correct. Yeah, the shrike-killed lizards don't have it anymore, right? They might have some sort of residual part, but most of them, it's going to be really hard to actually finish.
Ever collected a horn lizard? When you get a horn lizard that are in the process of getting that, one of the things it does is it takes its chin and tucks it down like this, so that those horns are sticking straight up in the air. Behavioral research.
They're like, watch out, man, I'll cut you.
She's so lazy.
Okay, so here's just an example of one of the concept maps that you could have come up with. These loggerhead shrikes engage in predation. And the words inside of the bubbles are ones that popped up in the word cloud. Engage in predation and imposes natural selection. This natural selection acts directly on horned lizard survival, particularly lizards that possess genetic variation that affects horn length. They looked at two types of horns, the parietal and the squamosal horns. And in that way, natural selection is acting indirectly on the horns. If that's the case, that can lead to an evolution, that will lead to an evolutionary response that is increased horn length that may or may not affect the evolution of their body in other ways or their behavior as far as their own securing food, that kind of thing. Okay. Why in this figure is quantitative genetic variation mentioned? Why would that be important to adaptation via natural selection? Pardon?
Just shows that different lizards have different lengths of horns, like not everyone's the same.
Not everyone's the same, okay. And so we're kind of coming up with a list of things that are important, right, for natural selection. Okay, we came up with that the trait impacts survival, right?
Or reproduction.
Or reproduction, we'll get to that in just a second. And that there's variation in the trait among individuals, okay? So that part, yes, I agree. There has to be variation in the trait among individuals. What about variation my son has his group of friends. They all have rainbow color hair, right? They will have different dyed colors of hair for every week of the year. That variation, even if it affected whether or not they survived, would it respond to selection? Let's say if they decided to dye their hair red, that they would be killed. Would that change the distribution of hair color in the following generation of those kids? No, why?
Because you just mentioned the price between this genotype and dyeing. So dyeing simply does not affect the genetic code of the particular system.
We need that trait to have a genetic basis, and we need that genetic basis to also have variation. We need genetic variation that is reflected in the trait, okay? So we need a variation in the trait, and we need some significant portion of that variation to be genetically based. Okay, so we need genetic variation. We've got just a couple more minutes. Okay, so we need survival, we need variation in the trait, we need a significant portion of that variation to be genetic, and as Isaac mentioned before, we also need reproduction. I'm gonna put that up here. I'm gonna put it in two places. We actually need the trait to impact fitness. Now, fitness in evolutionary biology is not fitness the way you and I think of it as far as going to the gym. It means it's a combination of survival and reproduction. If you survive and you don't reproduce, your genes still don't go on to the next generation, right? Dr. Quincy's like, yes.
That's me. I survived, but I did not reproduce. Oh, my genes are dead.
But your cell is happy. Okay, so we need a trait that actually impacts fitness. So it needs to impact, and fitness is made up of survival and reproduction. Okay, we need variation in fitness from individual to individual. If the trait impacts your survival or your reproduction, but everybody survives and reproduces really well to the same extent, then you're not going to have preferential selection for certain individuals and certain traits. These are the 4 conditions necessary for adaptation via natural selection. You've got variation among individuals for the trait of interest. The trait is heritable. That means that that variation has a genetic basis. Individuals have to reproduce, and there's got to be variation in fitness among individuals that is then related to the trait. So the learning goals for today are those 4 preconditions, those 4 conditions necessary for adaptation via natural selection, and predation of shrikes on horned lizards as an example. Now I want to point out that this experiment did not show all of these things. So keep that in mind. We'll discuss that a little bit further later. For preparation for class after the break, we won't have class on Monday, it's Labor Day. For preparation for next Wednesday, you'll want to set aside an hour and a half probably to prepare, possibly 2 hours, because there's a little bit of textbook reading. There's a 50-minute video on the Galapagos Islands. And also I want you to kind of dig around on Google Earth a little bit, because we're going to launch into more detailed study of the Galapagos Islands.
Concept maps for class.
Some more finches, yep. Don't forget to turn in your individual concept maps and word clouds before you leave. Enjoy the 3-day weekend.
Thank you.
So just look at for this